My spear rests heavy in my hand. Part 2. 2 years later. Where the fuck have you been, you jackal-faced sister-fucker? I was fond of Babu, but he could be tiresome when he was in a bad mood. He was standing in his spacious house, the sun-dried clay of the bricks brightly lit by the glaring daylight. I'd only just stepped inside the door. I looked at the mosaic pattern beneath my feet, away from Babu's corpulent body and his sunken eyes, and reflected, not for the first time, that a trader like him could definitely get a better mural installed if he wasn't such a miser. I was expecting you hours ago. Is that sour-ass birth Nebetra giving you my pelts? I don't see any pelts. Where are my fucking pelts? I took a deep breath, but Babu, as always, had not finished. When I found you, Mastanab, what did I think? What did I say to myself? I opened my mouth to reply, but Babu had practiced this speech time and again right to my face for years now, and I knew he had no interest in hearing what I had to say. I said, here's a funny sight. Here's a man with the darkest skin I've ever seen, covered in his own blood, lying by the river where the crocodiles like to hunt. And what did I do? I got as far this time as opening my mouth, before he grumbled on. I got my men to rescue you. I took you indoors, out of the goodness of my heart. I sent for physicians. I spared no expense. I fed you with the food I bought for my very own children. I sacrificed 3 crows to Hairspit the Wanderer, and I splintered your arm, and I let you sleep in my guest bed for weeks. My guest bed! For weeks! And now you come to me peltless while I send you to get pelts. I tried to speak again, but as always, Babu would finish his grumbling in his own time. I had never before met a person so capable of holding a full conversation by himself. Your left arm works because I saved it. Perhaps that isn't enough for you. I fed and clothed you for years now. Do you want my arm too? Should I cut off my left arm and give it to you? Perhaps my right arm as well. Would you like that? Do you want me to cut off my arm and bleed all over my floor for you? Of course, sometimes when he had those conversations with himself, he would get more than a little bit lost in them. He'd already reached the stage of his rant where he was gesticulating wildly and pacing up and down. Perhaps I'll do it here, over this wiggling bit of mosaic, or I could skin myself for you so that you can give me my own skin instead of the animal skins I sent you for. Has that shit Nebetra ever done anything for you? Do you want to work for him now? I could have made you my slave, you know. I let you keep your freedom even after helping you so much. I let you walk free, a free man. I let you carry weapons, and I gave you all new clothes, and I took you into my home, and now you want to go and work for Nebetra and his horrible sons who would take my money and not even give me the pelts I need to sell to the Zephanites. I gave up. He was reaching full flow now, and there was nothing to be done but stand back and let the rant wash over me. You'll be overseer of the whole town soon. Emir Nebetra, overseer of Infobek. A fine title. Everyone knows he's going to be overseer. Is that why you want me to go and work for him? Is that why you want to go to work for him? Is that why you abandoned me, the one who saved you and kept you and spent all that coin to keep you alive? All those daemons? And are you grateful? No. You leave me to work with that rotting dog who howls at the moon by night and kills cats for sport and a betcher. Babu paused for a moment, but I wasn't taking the bait. Go on then. Tell me what Nebetra said. The pause dragged on. I adjusted the itchy tunic I was wearing, breathed deeply of the moment of silence, and said, He's dead. That shut him up. I took advantage of the moment and ploughed on. He died in the night. I spoke to his brother, Pilly. They'll be sending some boys around with the pelts in a couple of hours, along with a refund. Babu was still standing, open-mouthed. Do you want to sit down or something? I said, adjusting the knife sheath on my belt. Dead? Said Babu. Are you sure you mean dead? Your Meronese is good, but it's not perfect. Do you mean ill, perhaps? I looked at him, and I saw to my surprise that he was very upset. I forgot sometimes that he and Nebetra had grown up together. Their rivalry had never been anything but friendly at its heart. He's dead, Babu. I'm sorry. Babu stumbled his way to the thick, cushioned lounging chair that took up one entire side of his entrance hall for guests, and sat down heavily. I gestured for one of the household slaves to bring water and went to sit beside him. He was breathing heavily, almost in panic, and I laid a reassuring hand on his shoulder. I should probably tell you of Babu, and how he found me, and what happened in the meantime, but there is, in truth, not much to tell. Babu was kind and generous for a merchant, and I detected no trace of any hidden agenda in him. He had found me delirious and wounded on the river bank, and had nursed me back to health, and even prayed for me, and then I'd worked for him while he used his connections to search for my friends. I do not remember the few months it took me to recover from the lion's attack, save for a blur of pain and exhaustion. It was a time of sickness and of sleep. As I drifted in and out of consciousness, I had begged for news of my companions, but there had been none, and after a while I began to think they were simply lost. I had planned to never tell him about the glass of Belmaeus, but during the festival of the reborn sun I had drunk myself into a stupor and told all. He did not believe me. Learning the language had been a challenge, but I had been gratified to discover it was similar to the one I already knew. After 6 months I could hold a conversation, and after a year I was fluent. Once I could speak enough of their language, and I had earned a little money, I convinced Babu to take me to the place on the river bank where he had found me. There had been nothing there, but after some cajoling he agreed to travel upstream with me to see if we could find the place I had been cast into the water. The river went on and on, wending endlessly through a vast expanse of empty desert, and though we walked for 2 days, I saw nothing I recognized. Reluctantly, I abandoned hope of finding them and went back to Infobek. I began to get used to the rhythms of life. It was a village on the southern edge of Phobek, a small kingdom trapped between the desert to the south and a much larger kingdom to the north. The people always seemed frantic, always trying to make money in one way or another. The only time they would do anything much for free was if the king or an official ordered it, for King Rashbek was their god, walking in the world, dreaded and respected by all. I realise I'm rambling. Perhaps it's for the best. In truth, with 2 years behind me and no news, I had all but given up on my friends and the 40,000 trapped behind the glass. I got on with life and forged a new path, and on quiet nights went roaming to shrines and temples, and lit incense, and said prayers to the wanderers and the strange animal-headed gods of the Phobekians, and wept. Babu stood up and began pacing. I could see the village through his front door behind him, white clay buildings clustered beneath the towering pillars of the temple of Nibitsit, and palm trees swaying in the gentle desert wind. I recognized this mood in Babu, frantic panic. He was good in a crisis, but while he was thinking his way through it, his thoughts would tumble out like a burst dam and threaten to overwhelm you. First I must be seen to be decent and good, he chanted on, so I shall send slaves with flowers and gifts to his family and offer to pay the funeral rites. Second, trade must continue in the town, though there must be an appropriate period of mourning, say 2 days. Then I shall offer to help his brother learn to trade and try to persuade him that the agreements Nebetra and I had still stand. That shouldn't be difficult. They were generous, so... Babu, I said, first shall we walk over and see them? Offer our condolences? It would mean a lot to Pilly and his children. Just come with me and see them now. It won't take long. Yes, said Babu. Yes, of course, you are right. I should bring something, a gift. Should I bring a gift? He was looking at me, a little lost when it came to showing kindness to others in a way other than financially. Beer, perhaps, I said. He looked like he could do with a drink, maybe a friend. We walked through the village as the sun was at its height. Word was spreading that Nepetra had passed away. There were huddles at street corners as people gossiped and spoke of funeral rites and remembered him in good times. He had been a warm and familiar face, the head of the village in practice, if not in name, though he had apparently never managed to sort out the drainage problem in the main street. It was muddy again, and Babu and I had to walk slowly to avoid splattering our tunics in filth, though our sandals would be in dire need of a thorough cleaning when we reached Nebetra's house. The priest of the temple of Nubitsit and a pair of acolytes were trying to process the statue of Nubitsit through the muck, their long blue robes drenched in mud and stuck to their legs. "Are you going to Nebetra's house, Pa Nubitsit?" asked Babu. "We are," replied the priest, keeping steely eyes on the acolyte. "Though we may be some time. Are you heading that way?" "Oh, yes." The priest nodded and said, Then give my apologies for my late arrival, and help them build a pyre if you can. New Bitsit would dislike his image defiled. The last words came out as a threat, directed to his acolytes as they stumbled and nearly dropped the statue of the vulture-headed god. Both of them looked terrified and awkward as they hefted it high again, groaning and sweating in the heat. As we went on our way, I considered again what kind of god New Bitsit was. A local god, but not a wanderer, and the people of Infobek prayed to him most fervently when there were sandstorms on the horizon. They talked about him like he was a guardian, a protector of their village, a kindly figure, in the way gods were not. "Why is the priest of New Bitsit conducting the funeral?" I asked. Said Babu. Because New Bitsit gives everyone from Infobek a gift before he guides them to the god of the underworld." "What sort of gift?" I asked, not truly interested, but trying to keep Babu occupied, stop him from dwelling. "Depends on the person," he said, picking his way through the mud. "Pa New Bitsit said that my mother was gifted a golden eagle to soar through stormy skies of the underworld and lead her to the sunny fields of Aru, or to rebirth, whichever she chose." I nodded. My people were not so lucky after death. Our spirits strode into the desert of the dead, and there we would either find our way to rebirth or become lost and wander forever, parched and hungry, luring the living to their deaths in turn with half-heard cries for help echoing across the dunes. "And just honestly, I agree with you. I shall be happy to help out with anything you need, Pilly. Your brother was my friend, and I shall miss him. He was an extremely clever man, and a thoughtful one. I always respected him, even when he got the better of me in that whole affair about the crocodile trapping for the festival of Soshet's Ascension, and I'm just so sorry, Pilly, truly I am." Babu had been speaking for 10 full minutes without surcease, and weeping for about half of it. Pilly was sat on the front doorstep, the white clay of the walls of Nebetcha's home glaring blindingly in the daylight, a look of pitiable misery on his handsome, dark face. There were dark spots on his white tunic, and though I dared not ask, I believed them to be blood. I could see Nebetcha's children some distance away, playing by the well, too young to truly understand what had happened. He would be a dull memory to them as they grew older, a grey figure from their distant past. Nebetcha's wife, Lapis, was facing their direction, but her eyes gazed far into the distance, staring at yesterday and all the days before, when Nebetcha was still here, still a part of her life. I went to her. Babu would be speaking for a good while yet, and Pilly didn't seem to mind his rambling. I laid a hand on her shoulder and felt her tense, and remembered that Phobekians were not like the Massacedae, and I should not have touched a woman I was neither married nor related to. I withdrew my hand and apologized. "It's fine," said Lapis in a monotone. "It does not matter. Nothing matters." "I'm so sorry," I said uselessly. How... I trailed off. It was a stupid question to ask, and the worst thing I could have said, and I had spoken without thinking. "I do not know," Lapis replied. "I awoke to an empty bed. There was cold linen beside me. I thought he must have been out all night drinking, like he did in the bad old days." I stayed silent as she gazed at her children, splashing water from the well at each other, laughing quietly, too young to understand. Then she continued. "I saw a shape in the antechamber, just inside the door where Pilly sits now. At first I did not know what it was. It was just my front door, and a strange lump on the floor. My husband. A great gash on his neck, and so much blood on the floor. He had a knife in his hand. I think he fought. I don't know if all the blood was his. He looked just uncomfortable, like he was sat awkwardly. His eyes were closed, his jaw was clenched. I don't know why he would look like that, I don't." She fell silent again. The sun was past its height, but the day was still absurdly hot, and she was shaking. "Lapis," I said, "go and sit with Pilly and Babu. We brought beer with us. I think you need it. I shall watch over your children for you, for the day, if you like." She nodded and stumbled off to Nebetcha's house. kicking up little clouds of dust as she walked. Her house now, I suppose, though I did not know how she could support herself or her children without him. "Children," I called. "Children, can we speak for a minute?" They came to me, eyes wide and full of uncertainty. They had seen me before, when I had come to Nebetcha's house, but we had never spoken. "You're Comte and Dakarai, is that right?" I asked. They nodded silently. Comte was barely 6 years old, and Dakarai was a year or so younger. "Right," I said. "Your mother's got to speak with Pilly and Babu for a while, so I'm going to be looking after you this afternoon. Is there anywhere you'd like to go? Anything you'd like to see?" Dakarai's lower lip wobbled, as if she was about to burst into tears at this news, and my heart sank. But then Comte spoke, in a loud, clear, high voice. "Can we go and see the Guardians?" I nodded. "Of course we can. Just let me tell your mother and Pilly where we're going, and I'll fill a water skin as well." She nodded dumbly when I asked if it would be all right for me to take the children away for a while. I took Babu aside and told him where we were going, and told him to send a messenger to ask me to return if she grew distraught. I left with Dakarai's little hand in mine, and Comte scurrying on ahead, the sound of Babu and Pilly reminiscing about Nebetcha as we made our way north. The Guardians were enormous. 2 great statues carved from black onyx, and older by far than the village. It was said they had been made not by mortal hands, but by the toil of the wanderers in the ages before the gods. Both faced south, over Infobek and into the deep desert, 30 feet tall despite the black onyx chairs in which they sat. The western one looked like a man, though his face was hidden behind a carved veil, and his fingers splayed out unnaturally long from his hands resting on the chair's arms and down into the sand at his feet. The eastern guardian was much stranger, with the head of a beetle and curled claws poking out from its robe. Both were so lifelike they baffled the mind, and new arrivals to Infobek were often seen trying to converse with them, or would drop to their knees in prayer at the sight of them. When I had first seen them, I remember feeling a wave of awe and terror. I felt like I was in the presence of gods. And now I was used to them. 2 vast figures looming in the daylight on the northern edge of the village. The children, who had never known a life without them, were climbing on them. "No higher than that, Comte," I called as he reached the lap of the easternmost statue, the one with the fingers that spindled into the sand. "Fine," he called, and I offered a silent prayer to any god who might be listening that he actually obeyed. I turned to Dakarai. She had been silent and sullen since we arrived, glaring at the Guardians with a kind of deep suspicion. I squatted down in front of her, trying to remember how to speak to children. Are you well, Dakarai?" I asked. "I don't like the Guardians," she said, frowning at the sand in front of her bare feet, fiddling with the edge of her little tunic. She was quite pale by the standards of the Febekians, and a burgundy birthmark blossomed on her left cheek. I stood up and went to lean against the eastern guardian, listening to Comte scrabble around above me. "These old things," I said, slapping the onyx seat of the bizarre figure. "They won't hurt you. They're just stone." "They're scary," said Dakarai. "There's really nothing to be scared of, I promise," I said, smiling as broadly as I could. "But okay, if you really like, we can just sit down here for a bit, in the shade." She nodded and sat beside me. I slumped down to the ground. In truth, I was pleased she had chosen this. The heat of the day had grown oppressive, and I was grateful for the rest. "Is Mummy all right?" she asked, and a shiver ran through me. "She will be. She's upset right now, but she'll be herself in time. She's just had, a shock. She's just had a shock is all. Come on, have some water. It's really hot." Dakarai nodded and eagerly took the water skin I offered, drinking deeply from it. I accepted it with a nod as she handed it back, then braced myself. I was certain she would ask about her father next, and I did not know what I could say. It was not my place to explain death to an infant. I was a foreigner, not her parent, and my people walked different paths to hers. But I was mercifully mistaken. Instead, she doodled in the sand with a stick she had carried from her home. She looked pensive and uncomfortable. For a moment I thought she needed to relieve herself, but she let out a long sigh and remained silent. When I turned to go, she let out a long sigh again. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" I asked. She was about as subtle as a thrown rock. "I don't know why Daddy fell over." I frowned. "What do you mean, Dakarai?" "Well, I mean, I'd got up in the night, and I heard Daddy coming in, and he smiled at me, and then he fell over. There was loads of blood." I sat for a moment, stunned, then put an arm round her. Her teeth were chattering. She was terrified. "Did you... Was there anybody else there?" I asked. She shook her head and said, "He just fell over. He made a funny noise and reached out to me, but I was scared and ran." "I think we'd better take you back to your mum," I said, with a sudden cold, growing alarm that there was nobody in the village to tell. Nobody was in charge. There was a possibility that Babu would be named in here. It would be his job to root out Nebetcha's killer, and I knew what that would mean. "Comter," I called, "I need you to get down now. Come on, we need to go back." I could hear him scrambling around above me, so I stood up, thinking to offer to catch him if he jumped. "I'm stuck," said Comter. I tried hard not to sigh. Really, I did, but it just came out. I reached up and grasped one of the long spindly fingers of the Guardian and began to pull myself up. "Okay, Comter, I'm coming up. Dakarai, can you stay there a minute?" She agreed, and a hard scrabble ensued. The Guardians were harder to climb than they looked. The onyx was smooth and offered few handholds, despite its age, and hauling myself into his lap took far more effort than I had expected. I needed a moment of rest in all that heat. And then I looked up at Comter as he sat on the Guardian's arm, gazing off into the desert. "Comter," I said, "come on, we need to go." He glanced back at me and nodded and lowered himself to the lap. "I think there's a caravan coming," he said, pointing north. I peered out into the distance and saw near the horizon an unmistakable dust cloud. They were at least a day away by my reckoning, travelling from Nabetwi. I gingerly lowered Comter, and the children and I returned to their mother. The funeral was a long affair. The women of the village gathered to wail and shriek and chase his spirit away from the world of the living and into their underworld. A goat was sacrificed to Nubitsit, and the old priest rummaged around in its guts before proclaiming that the wanderers had gifted Nebetcha's spirit with a shimmering hedgehog to guide him beyond death. Then the drinking began. Nobody in Infabek was going to be doing any work in the morning. As the night drew in, the relatives of Nebetcha had returned from burying the body in a secret location to ensure that no deva, evil spirits, or robbers would find his corpse. I found myself sat with Babu by a roaring fire. The youths of the village were leaping over it, one by one, as one of them beat a drum and another played a reed flute, daring each other to take ever greater risks and let out squeals and puffs of embers when they misjudged and landed too close to the coals. "I used to be able to do that, you know," Babu said, slumped next to me at the side of somebody's house. "I was the fire-jumping king. I was the best." "I'm sure you were amazing, Babu," I said, stifling a yawn. I took another swig from my wineskin. The Infabekians made excellent wine. "I was." He watched as another lad cleared the fire cleanly, to applause from the girls watching on. "I wasn't always fat." He poked at his belly, watching it wobble, and giggled in that peculiar girlish way he always did when he was drunk. "Nobody was always fat, Babu," I said. I've no idea what it meant. I was a few wineskins deep at that point, and the world was beginning to swim around me. "I was like a gazelle," said Babu, "sleek and graceful, strong." He stared at the boys leaping the flames, and laughed a little to himself. "I tried to find it, he said at length. "Your mirror. I sent people out, asked all the traders." "And?" I asked, wiping tears from my eyes. "And nothing. There was nothing. Was it real?" "It was," I said. "I'm sure it was. I remember it." Someone was singing and playing a lyre, a fast tune to encourage the fire dancers. One almost fell, but righted himself and just barely cleared the coals. He smiled and laughed with the others as they cheered him on. "Well, there was nothing," said Babu. "All the way to Miranu, all the way to Zephanash, all the way to Astasi and Nathranhar, and there was nothing. Maybe they followed the river to the sea and found a boat and sailed off beyond the sunrise. I'm sorry, Mastanab. It must be horrible not to have a place to belong." I considered what he said for a while, and let my drunken words tumble out of my drunken mouth. "I do have a people. I have you, and a harem, and I like Pili, and I've lived here for a couple of years now. I know I look different, and my gods are different, but this is home. This is where I live. I like it here." I stood, unsteadily, I knew not why, and raised my voice as I continued. "I feel safe here, and protected and loved. I see the pillars at the gates of the temple of New Bitsit, and I know the rivers behind it and the desert beyond. I know the king of Phobek sits in his palace and rules this land with a fair and just hand. I love Phobek. I love the king." Nobody heard me, and Babu had thrown up and fallen asleep. I remember waking that morning in someone's hallway. My head felt like someone had hit it with a kopesh, but only until I stood up, at which point it felt much worse. The room swam, and my stomach felt sour and full, and I spent a panicked moment looking for a chamber pot before it settled, and I felt steady again, and set out toward the front door. I immediately tripped over Parnu Bitsit, who groaned and swore at me from his fetal position on the floor. His gorgeous blue robe was covered in dust, and it looked like there might be wine stains under that coating. I let him rest. If he woke and saw the damage, he might start shouting, and my head could not take it. Not right then. I stopped to lean on the wall outside my house. My head was swimming again, and I could hear the groans and snores of a few other people nearby. It was so hot here at night that people would often sleep outdoors, but it seemed to me that almost the whole village had done so the night before. I took a moment to try to remember the way to Babu's house. I had woken up, I assumed, in Parnu Bitsit's house, and I lived in Babu's guest room, so I thought it was east, through the central square, toward the rising sun. I walked backwards, the only way to keep the sun out of my eyes, stepping gingerly and slowly, feeling my way with my heel. I felt something damp underfoot moments before I smelled it, and without warning I was vomiting. It was grotesque, and far from my proudest moment, but when I stood up and wiped my mouth, already feeling a bit better for it, and turned around, it became a lot worse. I was in the square, the central plaza of the village, if you could call it that. It was small and dusty, and the statue of the king that stood proudly in the middle was said to look absolutely nothing like him. Nevertheless, it was decorated with fresh desert flowers whenever they were in bloom, and people left offerings to his glory and continued good health at the statue's feet. This was not a problem. In fact, it was entirely expected. What was next to the statue was a problem. Beside the statue of the king stood a 4-horse chariot. It was painted in garish reds and blues. The 4 horses whinnied and stamped their feet, each a beautiful thoroughbred, each from a distant, different land. Beside the chariot stood 3 young boys in white tunics. One was holding aloft a sky-blue banner emblazoned with the glaring black eye of the house of the king. On the other side of the chariot, on horseback, was the palest woman I had ever seen, in a light green dress and a wide-brimmed hat. On the chariot stood a man unlike any I had ever seen. The kohl around his eyes was thick and expertly placed, and his golden headdress was fashioned to look like the hood of an asp. Behind the chariot were around 100 men, each armoured in bronze scales and carrying a glistening Kopesh-style sword. The biggest problem, however, was right next to me, and had some of my vomit on his sandals. He too was armoured, but carried no sword. Instead, he carried an enormous horn, and was looking at me with a wry amusement, and not a little pity. He mouthed something at me. "What?" I said, stupidly. "I said I'm sorry," he whispered. "I have to announce the arrival of the prince." I got as far as saying, "What?" before he blew the horn right in my face. It was so loud I felt my ears pop, and my stomach vibrated as the thundering rumble went on and on. I don't entirely know how, but the next thing I knew I was sitting down, hands over my ears, eyes tight shut. Man or Deva? My hearing returned slowly, but the nausea was still strong. I fought it back, then noticed, to my surprise, that someone was waving a leather water skin in front of my face. I accepted it eagerly and drank deep from it before opening my eyes and saying, "Huh?" I said, "Are you man or are you Deva?" The man with the golden headdress was addressing me directly. I had no idea what all this was, but he seemed impatient and important, and I judged it best to answer him as truthfully as I could. "I'm a man," I said, "from south of the desert." The man in the golden headdress raised an eyebrow at that. Now he was closer, and he had disembarked from his chariot. I could see he was a little older than I had first thought. He had at least 40 years behind him. His thick black hair had whispers of grey, as did his plaited beard. His sky-blue robe covered what was quite clearly a muscular, vigorous frame. The little half-smile on his face put me at my ease. This was a man with a sense of humour. "South of the desert," he said. "Fascinating. And where is everyone else in the village? Surely this isn't a whole colony of slugger-beds." He raised his voice as he came to the end of the sentence, making sure it carried to the few villagers who'd begun to drift into the square. They were falling to their knees at the sight of the man in front of me, and I had the distinct impression I should remain on mine until he indicated otherwise. "There was a funeral last night," I said. "What? Speak up." I cleared my throat and tried again. "There was a funeral last night. The whole village was there. It's a holy day here." "Oh," said the man in the golden headdress, still keeping his voice raised and letting an edge of menace creep in. "It must have been popular for the whole village to take part. Who was it? Which beloved citizen of our southern border has made their way to the underworld?" There was a moment of silence, and I realized I was the person he expected to answer. I realized I'd become the mouthpiece of the village by mistake, and also realized I had no idea who this man was. "Nebecha," I said. "His name was Nebecha. He was a trader who—" The man in the golden headdress stood stock still and held up a finger next to my face. His expression had gone from one of wry amusement to a kind of blank coldness. "Nebecha," he said. I confirmed that yes, it was Nebecha. "Interesting. I have come to meet with Nebecha, and you tell me he was buried last night?" "Yes, he died yesterday morning." "Ah." The man with the golden headdress looked a little lost at that point. I watched him, took in the sight of him. His face was handsome and expressive, and up close I could see that the cobra headdress was not solid gold, but leaf painted over wood. A thick bronze key about the length of my forearm dangled from his belt, and his koppesh sword was made of that rare grey metal that the Deva made. "I came here to see Nebecha," he said absent-mindedly, fiddling with his beard. "This complicates matters. You, guide me to Nebecha's house, and I shall pay my respects to his family. Come, you 3 men, and you, Yasmin. Oh, and you, Basale. The rest of you, fall out. Sit down and take the weight off. I'm sure there's a tavern nearby, but don't get drunk. You're still on duty." "Who is he?" I whispered to Yasmin, the woman in the light green dress and broad-brimmed straw hat. I was walking with her, beside her and Basile, the herald carrying his huge trumpet ahead of the chariot, which the man in the golden headdress had remounted. I hoped desperately that the creaking and rumbling of its wheels would cover the sound of my voice. I was lucky. She smiled at my question and leaned in to answer. "He's Prince Rashidi. All his titles take forever to recite, and you're safest calling him your Highness. I'm Yasmin, by the way." She reached out her hand, and I took it and shook it awkwardly. "Mastanab," I said. "Pleased to meet you. Are you— I mean to say—" "I'm from Nathranhar, yes," she said curtly. I'd never met anyone from Nathranhar, but we'd heard of that distant empire even in the lands south of the desert. They said it went on forever, a vast empire of 1,000 nations and bizarre beasts. I had not expected them to be so pale that her arms were red, burned from the simple light of the sun. "So," I said, "what brought you to Phobek?" She considered a moment, looking up at a distant cloud. I was sent by my masters, she said. And you, what brings you north of the desert? War, I said. We lost. She looked at me, eyebrow raised. I think you might be a fascinating person to talk to. I insist you dine with me this evening. She rode off ahead and left me speechless behind her. It was not until much later I realized she had seemed to somehow know exactly where she was going. When we arrived at the house of Nebecha, I was surprised and a little worried to see Babu slowly getting to his feet exactly where I had left him the night before. The embers where the fire dancers had revelled had long since turned to ashes, and Pili was drawing water from a nearby well and pouring it over his head. Prince Rashidi pulled his chariot to a halt beside me, a wry smile on his face. I think we can dispense with the announcement of my arrival, he said to Basale. These people are in mourning. Babu's face, when he caught sight of the prince, was a thing to behold. Several expressions danced across it at once. First a slow recognition, then the gleam of opportunity, then a touch of fear, and then full-blown horror. His sunken eyes widened as far as they ever did, and he awkwardly lowered himself to his knees. His tunic was improperly done up, exposing his belly to the air, and it tangled awkwardly around his legs, slowing his descent still further. I was distracted enough watching my friend that I missed Pili's approach, though his efforts to abase himself before his prince came much more easily to him. Who are these two? Prince Rashidi asked. This is Pili, Nebecha's brother, I said, and Babu, his friend. I see, said the prince, and addressed Pili as he dismounted from his chariot. Then you have my condolences for your loss. I grieve with you. There was a warmth to his words, a sympathy that sounded genuine, and Pili thanked him with a wan smile. I have gifts for his widow and children, said the prince. Tell them to come and find me when they stir. For now I would speak with you, Mastanab, and you, Babu. Perhaps we should retire to the famous temple of Nubitsit. It is years since I last saw it. I would like to see it again. That, at least, was a shorter journey. The pillars rose up before us, and the dusty white clay brick arena with its blood-stained ground stood wide and empty before the vast main vulture statue towering over it all, screeching at the sky. The wingspan was at least 20 feet, and in the middle of the arena there was a huge wooden perch constructed by the Infobecians on the off-chance Nubitsit might wish to visit them himself. The smallest statue, the one that stood at the centre of worship and reverence, was still presumably at Pa Nubitsit's house. The plinth stood empty, and the last meal of the vultures that fed off the carrion the sacrifices to Nubitsit was picked clean. The prince absent-mindedly prodded the goat skeleton with a foot and muttered a prayer to the god. So then, he said, facing Babu with a smile, what am I to do now? Babu frowned. About what, Your Highness? He asked. About who should become emir. One of the prince's bodyguards was leaning against the clay brick wall of the arena. I don't know why I remember that. They were well disciplined, so perhaps that's why. The heat of the day was oppressive, and their armour must have been stifling. Perhaps Pili, I heard Babu say, and I immediately reddened. Babu was a delight, but would often hopelessly misread anything ever said to him. He was a constant worrier, and thought too little of himself. Babu, I said softly, as the prince stood staring incredulously. He means you. He wants to make you emir. Babu stood open-mouthed. But, Babu said, but Pili is Nebecha's brother. And he has never run a business before. Let alone a whole village, said Prince Rashidi, which incidentally I'm here to officially declare a town, unless the emir disagrees. Babu stood silent for a moment, before that other side took him over, the side that was solid business sense and opportunism. Well, of course, yes, but to have a town we shall need defences, surely. The Hashaben will hear of it and come raiding as well as trading. Perhaps a sturdy wall and a ditch and a lookout tower. I shall have to organise a watch, a proper one, not just old Atuma wandering about the lamp whenever he remembers. Also, we should have to build some... Yes, the prince interrupted. But first, if I shall be making use of your house for stabling and rest, I've been 2 days without a proper bed and only brackish water. Some wine or beer, as long as the people of Infobek didn't drink their entire supply last night. Also, I would suggest you do not make this announcement for a few days. Give everyone time to recover from last night's carouse before they're obliged to celebrate. Babu nodded silently. I could see he was still making vast mental lists of jobs to do, people to contact, policies to make. I offered to lead them to Babu's house, and we began the short walk. As we arrived, Babu's children were at their lessons, and the ancient tutor Babu had hired was demonstrating how to write on clay tablets, quietly encouraging them. I had recommended a harsher teacher for them, one less prone to dozing off in the middle of the mornings, but Babu insisted that only age grants wisdom, and I would not hear any more of it. I believe he was concerned that a younger tutor would be much more likely to beat them. Perhaps he was right. I left Babu to introduce the prince to his household and went to rest. I needed water, as the rush of shock that had sobered me up began to wane and the headache began to return. I managed to convince a few of the 100 soldiers the prince had brought with him to stand guard at Babu's door, and found some water for them after pouring quite a lot of it over my head by the well, then retired to my bedroom and closed the shutters. I slept. I dreamed. One towering figure speaking in a booming, distant voice above a multitude of weeping, pleading shadows, all wreathed in darkness. When I woke up, my eyes were wet, like I had been weeping in my sleep. Osazi, Babu's aging housekeeper, was knocking at the door and shouting my name. I could see by the light shining through the shutters that I had slept away most of the day. I got up, groggy, cursing Babu and Osazi, and dressed myself before I opened the door. "What?" I said tersely. "Lady from Nathrin wants to see you," said Osazi, who I saw had put on her best clothes, and for the first time I could remember, had applied makeup. "She's waiting downstairs in the hall." I grunted my thanks as I closed the door, and realized I felt a desire to be better dressed for the occasion. I dug through my clothes until I found a finely woven long tunic in vibrant rainbow colours that I remembered had garnered a few compliments from the local women. I also spent a moment quickly shaving. Most men in Phobek wore beards, but I'd never got used to them and elected to keep my face smooth as I always had. I saw her from the top of the stairs. Her light green dress was dazzling against the drab white buildings and the grubby weeds that grew sparsely in Infobek. She smiled at me, and I grinned back and greeted her as I made my way down to the main hall. "You feeling better for your rest?" she asked me, dimples appearing on her cheeks as she smiled. "Much better," I replied. "Thank you. Are Babu and the prince getting along?" "Well, the prince is speaking with Nebetcha's family at the moment. Come, the servants have prepared us a meal, meat and bread and some sort of cheese, I believe." The Infobekians loved their famous cheese, made from the hardy goats they would herd. They were said to guard the secrets of its creation jealously, but after this long drinking and living with them, I knew full well what herbs they added to give it its unique flavour. We sat and began to eat, though I declined wine. "Oh, a shame," Yasmin said. "It is an excellent vintage, but it's good to know your limits. You may be required to work on the morrow." I nodded, a little shamefaced. "I understand you had questions for me," I said at length, the silence growing awkward as I found I had a difficult time looking her in the eye for some reason. She said. "Tell me about it. I want to hear all about Mastanab and his people. I've never met anyone that far south." "Very well," I said, thinking desperately where to start. We were a sizable tribe, mostly hunters, raiders, goat herds, breeders of water buffalo, that sort of thing." "Were?" she asked. "We were driven north. There was a war. We lost." I had said those words before, but they still stung, and I still felt myself compelled to say them to anyone who asked. I do not know why. Perhaps it was a kind of penance. "Oh, I'm sorry." And that was a rare response. Too often people dislike refugees, as if we're tainted by defeat. "We had a temple," I said, trying to move on from the subject, "to Balmaeus, the god who freed our tribe from the Deva. It was made of black stone, and the tower was 50 feet high." "That sounds wonderful," she said. and even then I knew she was just being kind. What were your homes like? Were the roads paved? I want to hear everything. I want to be able to picture it as if I was there. So I told her. I told her about the wooden causeways we would build from the wood of the unto trees, and the river that ran on the southern tip of the great desert. I told her about the ditches we would dig to ward off enemy raiding parties, and the shadow of the mountain where the old bones live. I told her about the Kiribeden and the Abomwe, and all the tribes that arrayed against us, and all the ways they tried to steal our land by the river. I told her about the raids we launched, and the raids we repelled, and the night before we fled, when the land before me was ablaze with 1,000 watchfires. And you? I said, finally having long since given in to the temptation for more wine. Tell me about Nathran. Yasmin smiled, topping up our cups. Well, it's a long way from here, she said, and I was brought up in the Tower of Perfection, among the devotees of the Perfected One. Mine is a life of study and contemplation, while outside the lowest folk till the fields under the supervision of the low folk, and the high folk reap the rewards. The highest, one foreigners call Emperor, rules over it all, a god to his people. So which are you? I asked. Lowest, low or high? She smiled again with wry amusement. None. And that would be a rude question in Nathran, as if devotees at the Tower of Perfection are outside the great hierarchy. We're sent to advise on holy matters and maintain order, and only the highest is above our judgment. I frowned, not understanding. Surely that makes you higher than the high folk? Well, that's why the low folk and the lowest often say, she said. They hate us, but we're part of the way of things in Nathran. Without us, despots would do as they will, and there would be no safety or justice. So you're magistrates? I asked. Of a sort, she said, but mostly we're scholars, and from time to time we're sent far afield. Is that why you're here? Yes, she said. There is something here of great interest to the Perfected One. I am to find out what it is. I pondered this for a moment, trying to figure out what she could possibly mean, and then the door crashed open. The breeze of the night brought with it a dozen of the prince's warriors clattering into the building in their bronze armour. Before I knew it, 2 of them had lifted me back from my seat and were holding me face first against the wall as Yasmin shouted at them for an explanation. And then I heard Babu scream. They had forced me painfully to my knees in the main hall with Babu beside me. Yasmin had been outraged, commanding the captain of the guard to stand down, but he had refused and taken her to one side, and she had left the room with a look of cold fury. The guards bound my hands and warned me not to try to move, and refused to answer my questions. Why are they doing this? Babu whispered to me when the guard looked like he might be out of earshot. Did you do something? What did you do? I didn't do anything, I hissed back. You must have done something. Someone in this house. Who? Oh, Sazi? He replied sarcastically. Or my children? No. Maybe it was Sazi. Maybe she undercooked the prince's chicken or gave him some bad wine or something. Is that something he'd arrest us for? I asked. I've no idea, Babu said. How would I know what princes do? Would the princes in your tribe arrest someone for bad wine? We don't have princes, I said. I think you've latched onto this bad wine theory without any reason. It could be anything, and it might not be the prince. Have you thought of that? These guards are a long way from home, an out-of-the-way village, with nobody to know what they do here. What does that mean? Said Babu. I mean, what if they're planning to assassinate him? I said. Babu's eyes went wide, and he gasped loud enough for one of the guards to turn and glare at us. I tried to act naturally, but Babu was shaking like a terrified girl. What was that? Said the guard, walking towards us. Nothing, I said, wriggling against the ropes binding my wrists behind my back and realizing they were bound fast. He just has bad knees. He's uncomfortable. The guard grunted, though what he meant by that was beyond me, and went and stood at his post by the main door. I took time to study his armour. Mostly thick leather, plates of bronze decorated with the pictorial writings of the Fubekians. Bronze plates adorned his shins and the top of his feet, and overlapping leather skirts were dotted with bronze studs. Ordinarily, I assumed, it would be all polished and shining brightly with a reflected candlelight, but their journey had been long, and the road dusty, and it all looked rather brown and dull. Only his Kopesh sword shone, with a subdued gleam of murderous iron. The fire in the hearth, which Osazi had lit, avoiding eye contact with us in total silence, guttered for a moment, as if a windstorm was blowing. I frowned, trying to figure out what could have caused it, trying to distract myself from the dreadful foreboding I felt about being bound and under guard. I heard shouting outside, and my heart lurched. It took me a moment to identify Yasmin in hot conversation with another voice, far calmer and male. I was fairly sure it was the prince, and as he strode into the hall, I realized I was correct. "You!" he shouted, so furious that veins were standing out on his temples, and his arm quivered as he pointed fingers at Babu. "I accuse you of murder. I accuse you of murder and of treasonously lying to steal the holy title of Emir from me!" It was terrifying. His voice was so loud it hurt my ears, and even the guard blanched in fear. The prince was not the jovial man of the people I had spoken to earlier. He was not the smiling figure I had met earlier in the day. He was a fountain of unfettered rage. He flung aside the table in the centre of the room as if it weighed nothing, and advanced on Babu. Without stopping, or even slowing down, he backhanded Babu in the face, knocking him to the floor. Babu's head bounced off the tiles with a clunk, and he cried out. The prince lowered himself, put a knee on Babu's chest, one hand on his face. There was blood leaking from a nasty-looking cut behind his ear, and the prince snarled at him, hissing his rage. "I spoke to poor Nebetcha's child," said the prince through gritted teeth. Without his cobra hood headdress, he looked more human. His shoulders looked broader, his arms thicker, muscles bunched in arms as he continued speaking. "Do you know what she told me? That innocent little thing. Do you know what she said she saw? She saw her father cut down in the night. She saw him murdered." At this point he lifted Babu's head and bashed it against the floor with every word. "She saw his throat cut in front of her." The prince stood, turning his back on us. "She is 3 years old. You were his rival. You're the only one to gain. The only one. Do you have anything to say? Anything at all?" said the prince, clenching and unclenching his fists. I could see that Babu was trying to move and having difficulty. There were gashes all down the left-hand side of his head. There was blood everywhere. I know I should have opened my mouth and said something, anything in his defence, but Baal Oris and Baal Ammon helped me. I was terrified. Yasmin finally spoke up. She had been stunned into silence by Prince Rashidi's brutality, but was now clearly incensed at the display. "How can you do this?" she shouted. "He was bound and arrested. There's been no jury impaneled. He's not pleaded his case. The little girl told you again and again she did not see who attacked her father, you brute. Who do you think your ancestors smile on that outburst? Do you think they approve?" "You," he said to her now, pointing at her with a bloody hand. "You overstep. I am Prince of Infobek. I am not to be spoken to like a common churl. This low-born villain was going to be uplifted to nobility, and the idea that he tried to do so with vile murder is unspeakable. What are you looking at?" She was staring over his shoulder with an expression of acute concern. I looked, and saw what looked like a zephyr, a little whirlwind, specks of sand writhing through the air. The hairs on my arms and on the back of my neck stood up as I saw it was shivering, slowly coalescing speck by speck into the shape of a man. Almost a man. It was indistinct in the middle of the hall, lit by flickering firelight and howling an animal howl. The only part of it that did not take the right shape was its head. I expected the man of sand to finish and be somehow complete, but its head was mostly mouth. No eyes, no nose, nothing but a gaping maw full of knife-like teeth of sand. "What is it?" asked the prince, looking straight at it. "What are you looking at?" I could barely hear him over the screeching wail of the thing in front of me. The sound grew louder, and the room shook with it. "What were the last words the prince spoke. 3 more creatures of sand and dust shimmered into being and advanced with dreadful agility and speed towards Prince Rashidi, and the 4 of them reached out with claws of sand and tore with snarling savagery into his neck and belly. Others slithered out of the gloom and began to tear into the guards. I shall never forget those butchering sounds, the wet, thudding crunches. I shall never forget the feeling of Prince Rashidi's warm blood splattering across my face. I shall never forget the sight of those creatures turning to me, their mouths agape, red tongues lashing around their massive teeth, sand fingers grown to a foot in length and tapering to awful claws. Sand flowed off them whenever they walked, puffs of it lingered in the air. Babu screamed. They were coming. Phantoms of sand. They were going to kill me. Can you describe a thing in one word? Not just the thing, but all of it, through all of time, from its creation to its destruction, from its use to its strengths, to its weaknesses, who loved it, who loathed it. Can you make a sound that embodies creation and destruction? Yasmin could. She could make a sound that told the story of the world. She could speak with the voice of truth, a truth so complete that the world could not deny it. That at least is how I understand it. I am told I am incorrect in every way, but that's what it sounded like to me. As the creatures blinked towards us, raising claws and snarling, Yasmin made a sound, spoke a word that was more than a word, a single word. Shield. She was behind me, slicing through the ropes binding my hands. In front of me the phantoms of sand stopped, unable to move forward. Something was holding them back, a barricade I could not see. "Wha—" I said, before I was interrupted by Babu. "What the fucking hell is happening?" "I don't know," said Yasmin, as I stood up and massaged my wrists, and she cut Babu free. "But I promise I'll explain it when we're away from here." "My children," said Babu. "Are safe," said Yasmin. "They're with Pilly and Lapis. I had your housekeeper take them there before the prince came back. I'm sorry. I knew something was wrong here. I never could have imagined this." She raised her arms over her head and began to slowly back toward the side door, the way to the kitchen and larder. The creatures of sand were between us and the main door to the house, and the prince's body, torn completely in half across the waist, lay sprawled repulsively across the mosaic floor. I picked up a khopesh, slipping in a patch of blood and almost tripping over the pitiful remains of a guard. Babu hauled himself to his feet, clutching his bleeding head. "Stay with me," said Yasmin. "The shield only extends so far." And for a moment I thought I could see it. For a moment there was a glimmer in the air between us, and the things now lashed in fury. They were howling and shrieking, battering at the barrier before us. The three of us retreated through the kitchen, slowly backing away. I tripped over what turned out to be Osazi's body, huge gashes running from her neck down to her waist. The creatures seemed to leave people's faces alone, but would ruin the body with ferocious abandon. I felt sick, even in the heat of war, even on battlefields, even when I had killed men. I had not seen such wanton butchery. I was already horrified, desperate to get away from whatever curse had sent those creatures after us, and when we got outside onto the market square, I saw a scene from the hells. Corpses were everywhere. The prince's bodyguard had been torn to pieces, their blood staining the dusty ground, their weapons and armour shredded, and their attackers. I thought they were feasting at first. I thought the phantoms of sand, these wraiths of dust and noise, were eating the corpses of the men they had killed. But I was wrong. They were tearing at their skin, peeling it back, pulling out whatever guts they could and flinging them aside, as if they were trying to hollow out the dead. Whatever designs they had for those corpses I did not care to discover. I knew only that they had destroyed the mortal remains of these men, that they howled a miserable, deafening lament, and they had drenched the market square in blood and ravaged meat. "The horses," said Yasmin, her face ashen. "We must get to the horses." We crept slowly in the darkness, leaving the phantoms that had attacked us to interfere with the dead in the market square. We found our way by moonlight, and tried to ignore the screams. Babu was insensible, and I guided him, lost in his madness, lost in terror. We found the prince's chariot, and the horses stabled beside it, and saddled them before we lifted each other into place. Then we stole away into the night, riding north, riding hard, away from the desolation behind us.